Hi, I'm just going to give people a couple more seconds to log in. Make sure everyone's got their cup of tea, or maybe their iced lemonade, as it is finally a bit sunny after this week's summer solstice, the coldest and wettest I can remember. Great. Well, welcome everybody to this Law Family Commission on Civil Society event on lessons from the Devolved Nations. I'm very pleased to say we have three fantastic speakers with us today who will be reflecting on the relationship between civil society and government in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And I will introduce those speakers in just a moment. For those of you for whom this is your first PBE or Law Family Commission event, PBE, we're a charity. We use the tools and insights of economics to support the social sector and wellbeing across the UK. And we mainly do that by working with individual charities to better understand the economic impact of their programmes and services. The Law Family Commission on Civil Society is a broader piece of work that we launched at the end of last year. It's 2 years of research and policy work that is focused on the future of civil society in the UK. You can read much more about the Commission. You can read our publications. We've actually got a lot more publications coming in the sort of next few weeks or so. All that information is available on the website, and I think my colleague Sabine will put a link to that in the chat. You can also sign up for our newsletter there if you want to be kept up to date with our work. So a key theme for us in the Commission is the relationship between civil society and government. We really want to know, is it working at the moment? What are the opportunities to make that relationship stronger? And as we've been thinking about this question over the last few months, in conversations I have with people, I keep hearing people saying, we absolutely need to look to the devolved nations because things work differently there, and maybe they work a bit better. And in fact, because this is a PBE event, I'm afraid I'm going to have to take the opportunity to just share one slide with you. I'm afraid that's mandatory at PBE events. So this is a bit of work we did, my colleague Jack did, exploring how many times civil society or words connected to civil society, so things like charity, community group, social enterprise, how many times they get mentioned in party election manifestos. And what this chart shows is the top 3 bars are how many mentions words connected to civil society got in general election manifestos. And the bottom bars show us how many times those words got mentioned in devolved parliament election manifestos. And what we can see very clearly from this is that civil society gets far less coverage in general election manifestos than it does in the devolved parliaments. And actually, this is not just a party issue. Even when we look at general election manifestos of parties that are based in the devolved nations, we see the same pattern occurring. So I think what we can take from this is an idea that perhaps it's not just a matter of the grass looking greener, maybe it really is greener. At PB, we've got a few ideas about why this might be. Our research associate, David Ainsworth, has published an article on the Commission website today, which shares a few of our reflections on what might be driving the strength of relationship between civil society and the devolved nations governments. But even better than that, today we have 3 real experts on that topic. So from Northern Ireland, we're joined by David Sterling. David is an extremely experienced civil servant. He's been permanent secretary at multiple departments, and his most recent role was actually as head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service until he retired recently. And among the many challenges that I'm sure David faced over his career, and I bet we could have several webinars on things that David's done over the past years. He was, of course, heading the civil service at the time when the Northern Ireland Assembly was suspended, which I think probably makes my bad days at work feel like a real breeze. But he's also on the board of a number of charities, including chairing the Chief Executives Forum in Northern Ireland. So we're very lucky to have David with us. From Wales, we are joined by Kate Young. Kate is the director of the All Wales Forum of Parents and Carers, supporting thousands of family carers across Wales. She's also on the board of the WCBA, and particularly relevant for us, she is the Health and Social Care representative for the Third Sector Partnership Council, and also sits on various ministerial advisory groups and policy groups. And I'm sure she'll be telling us more about what those roles entail. And then finally from Scotland, we are joined by Teresa Shearer. Teresa is joining us, I think, with 3 of her many hats today. So she is CEO of the Enable Group, which again supports thousands of individuals and families living with learning disabilities and support needs in Scotland. She's also vice convener of the SCVO. And finally, she is a commission on the Law Family Commission on Civil Society. I've missed about 90% of her CV there, but needless to say, she has a very strong perspective, both as a civil society leader and as somebody closely involved in the world of policy. So thank you all for joining us. I'm wondering when you all have time to do your laundry, let alone do webinars like this in amongst all those other things, but thank you for joining us. I'm going to pass to the speakers in just a moment. Just a reminder to everybody on the webinar, feel free to use the chat function to interact. You can also use the Q&A function to raise questions from panelists, and I will try and get to as many as I can in the last sort of 20 or 30 minutes of today's session. This event is being recorded and it will be available if you want to share it with colleagues and friends afterwards. And finally, just a reminder, if you'd like to tweet about the event, please do so. You can tag us on @ProBonoEcon. I think Sabine will pop that in the chat too. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to David. I'm very intrigued to hear particularly sort of how he's managed this very complicated situation over these last years and sort of how civil society played a role in that. Thank you, David.
Okay, thank you, Anushka. I'm delighted to be here, great opportunity, and thank you for the invitation. You've given me quite a challenge for 7 minutes, so can I say at the outset that actually you or anybody else who's interested in what's happening in Northern Ireland would be very welcome to actually come over either virtually or in person to just see what we've done and explore what I'm about to say in a little more depth. It's difficult for me to make comparisons, so what I'm going to focus on really is what I think has worked well in Northern Ireland and really what maybe sort of point to some of the things that we think we could do better. Actually, I'm delighted that online this morning is Moira Doherty, who's a director in our Department for Communities, who has responsibility for community development and indeed a whole lot of other things, and by Seamus McAlevey, who's chief executive of NICFA, the Northern Ireland Council for Voluntary Action, which is an umbrella body for the voluntary community sector in Northern Ireland, has over 1,000 members. And indeed, both Moira and Seamus can indeed correct anything that I maybe don't get quite right. So what I'm going to say is very much my own views. And first, a few words about Northern Ireland. We're a small place with quite an elaborate governmental structure. With 1.9 million people, we're smaller than Greater Manchester. Yet we've got 18 MPs, 90 members of our Legislative Assembly, 11 councils and 462 councillors. We have 5 political parties in our executive headed up by 2 First Ministers who actually must operate as a joint office. The nature of these political structures which flow from the Good Friday Agreement are such that little is done here that isn't that doesn't have political consensus. Not always a recipe for quick decision taking, and it's a matter of record, obviously, that we're subject to too many periods of political instability. But it's in this context that I think I would say that the relationship between government and civil society in Northern Ireland is actually very good and indeed getting better, though there is definitely room for further improvement. I'd point to a number of factors which lead me to this conclusion. Firstly, our size. Scale is our friend. Northern Ireland is a village. It's often said the best thing about Northern Ireland is that everyone knows everyone else. It's also said that the worst thing about Northern Ireland is everyone knows everyone else. But joking aside, personal relationships are important and our size makes it easier to develop and maintain relationships. It also means it's relatively easy for people to get access to senior officials and to ministers. Secondly, civil society has traditionally had an influential role in Northern Ireland and has done so for many years, partly as a legacy of our troubled past. During the 28 years of direct rule, Westminster ministers would often consult civil society as a means to bridge a democratic deficit that existed at the time. And it's actually been notable over many years the way in which civil society, that's business organizations, the voluntary community sector, trade unions, have all been able to come together on campaign on specific issues, and quite effectively as well. Thirdly, there is strong political support across all 5 parties for the voluntary and community sector, with many of our politicians actually having strong roots at community level. And the fourth thing, I think, is as well is we have a very vibrant and effective voluntary and community sector and a growing social economy with many successful social enterprises. And these organisations have performed very well and do much very good work. 3 factors, I think, in my view, have strengthened the relationship between civil society and government. Going back to 2016, central government led on the development of a draft programme for government, an outcomes-based approach, very much like what Scotland has pioneered and indeed which Wales has now adopted as well. And working together, and with a very broad consensus, we identified a range of outcomes which together set out what we would like Northern Ireland to be in the future. And again, worth looking at what the Scots and the Welsh have done in this area as well. They're more advanced than us. But this work has provided a framework for more cross-sectoral collaborative activity. And the challenge for us now is to get agreement on a final programme for government and to move forward. But without that framework, I think everything else becomes much more difficult. The second factor is that during the 3 years where we had no ministers, we actually, one of the positives was we saw a reduction in silo working within departments and much better collaboration across government and into the business sector, the voluntary community sector, and with arm's length bodies. This actually helped with our contingency planning for Brexit, which was a major feature during the 3 years without ministers, and indeed where we did need to engage very heavily with the business sector and the voluntary community sector to plan for all the various Brexit eventualities that were foreseen. And that Brexit contingency planning was good preparation for the COVID pandemic, and indeed without it, I doubt we'd have coped as well as we did. Now, time prevents a detailed analysis of the work that was done during the pandemic. Suffice to say that the collaborative effort between central government, local government, the voluntary community sector and the business sector was superb and covered community well-being. A huge amount of work was done just to make sure that the most vulnerable in society were looked after. That included providing access to food, and again, a superb collaborative effort between public sector, private sector to ensure that people who needed food got it. And we'd initially estimated maybe 40,000 people in need. It turned out there was probably double that or more who actually had to be supplied. We did a lot of work to sustain charities financially and in other ways. We provided a lot of community helplines, and we did a lot to support community grassroots organisations. Happy to go into that in much more depth as well. So in the short time remaining, what could we do better? At the political level, we do need that programme for government to provide a framework for tackling the deep-rooted problems that continue to blight too many of our communities: poverty and disadvantage, health inequalities, economic activity, etc. The second thing is, I would accept, I think there's still a slight tendency for central government to think it knows best. Trust and mutual understanding are critical, and central government needs to do more to ensure that the role of the voluntary community sector is understood and valued in the policy process. Co-design and co-production must be real and meaningful and not just buzzwords. The third thing, and this is really important, is we need to find a better way of funding the voluntary community sector organisations for what they do. There's too much bureaucracy in our current processes and a lack of long-term funding arrangements. In fact, this blights the whole of government in Northern Ireland. We haven't had a multi-year budget since 2011. And the fourth thing, and I'll conclude on this, is that we need to value the voice of civil society. Voluntary community work bodies have a knowledge of what is happening at street level that we can't replicate in government. And indeed, the role of the business bodies as well has been vital in helping us to deal with Brexit. So those would be my quick views, and I will pause there.
Many thanks, David. Lots of food for thought there, and a reminder, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A function. I mean, just before we move on to Kate, David, for that period when Northern Ireland didn't have an executive, how important was civil society actually for helping sort of keeping society going and how did that engagement work without ministers?
It was vital, and it was good that we had relationships and structures in place that helped us through that. So, like, for example, you go back to 2017 when the institutions first collapsed, it was discovered that we actually didn't have the power to issue money other than a very limited way. And one of the things that I did, I was in the Department of Finance at the time, was arrange a meeting with Seamus McAlevey, who's online as head of NICFA. And he made the point, we used that framework just to explain the predicament that we were in, and to, again, we were able to use our relationships to help explain how we were going to address the problems that were arising from the lack of ministers. Again, it was very much just about that mutual understanding, trust, and respect. We in central government recognizing that an awful lot of people in society depended on the services provided by third sector organizations, and that if we didn't continue to fund them properly and provide them with support, there was going to be a major impact on society. So, as I say, it was in that sort of particular area that it was important we used the relationships we built up.
Great, thank you, David. So I'm going to move on to Kate now to give a perspective from Wales.
Thanks, Prynhawn Darpawb. Good afternoon, everybody. Some similar things in my analysis to David's in terms of Wales. Wales is also a small nation. We have just under 4 million people. We're still relatively community focused. Although we're a national nation, in many ways, we're still made up of lots of very small communities. And in a sense that keeps the voice of civic society quite strong in those communities. In terms of our makeup, we have obviously the Senedd, which has 60, they used to be known as assembly members, they're now ministers of the Senedd, that sit in the Senedd building, 22 local authorities, which, to be fair, for such a small nation seems an incredible amount of local authorities. Some of them are very small, and sometimes that doesn't help them, and 7 health boards. And in fact, that structure can sometimes cause problems, because in the North Wales, we have a health board that's connecting to several local authorities, and then we can take Powys as a vast and beautiful area of Wales where you have one local authority and one health board together making up a region. So that can create its own benefits and problems as a structure. The Senedd as a building is an interesting chamber. It's sort of almost in the round. And I think that's quite interesting in terms of the relationships that ministers that sit in that Senedd building have with each other. There isn't they have their own zones, if you like, but there isn't a sort of a side. There's this side and then there's that side. There's a sort of shared gap in the middle that everyone speaks into. And I think that's quite interesting for the kinds of debates that the members in the Senedd have. In some ways, it makes the conversations a bit more intimate when they're talking in that space, and can present some interesting challenges for them. Like David has alluded, in Wales, a lot of our ministers have got backgrounds or connections to civil society organisations. Many of them actually started off careers in civic society and then chose to take their political interests to move into the world of working at the Senedd level and government level. And quite a lot of our civil service members that we connect to also have voluntary roles connected to the civic society. So there is that sort of relationship. And the phrase that David alluded to about, the problem with Northern Ireland is everyone knows everybody. We have that in Wales as well. It's quite a close-knit set of communities, and often it will be the same faces that you'll see in places. Sometimes that's really good for building up relationships, and sometimes, if we're honest, it can actually potentially hinder, because we're not necessarily seeing new people or other community groups that perhaps we should be hearing from, because it can sometimes be the same faces. So that can bring its challenges as well. Personal relationships are also critical in Wales, because of the structure we've got and the fact that we're quite a small country. The relationship between civic society and government tends to be quite close and quite positive in many ways. There are challenges. There are challenges around funding. There are challenges about different community groups having their voice heard. But there's actually some strong structural things that are in place in Wales to make sure that civic society has a voice to be heard. We have the WCVA, that's our umbrella council body and organisation, that is funded directly by government. Part of that structure is one of the hats that I've got on today, which is the Third Sector Partnership Council. That is a deliberate engagement structure that exists within Welsh Government in partnership with civic society in order to enable key voices from different parts of the civic society elements to come together and to be heard. So in that network, you'll have representatives like me from health and social care. There's someone there from children. There's a network around environment. There's a network around equalities, network around faith, communities and community development. And we come together as a network to talk about the entirety of what's impacting on civic society, but we also have individual ministerial meetings with key ministers with different portfolios to explain what matters to different areas of that civic society that we're in and representing. Those ministerial meetings are attended by those ministers. I know that sounds like it should be sort of fait accompli, but I don't think it is. Quite often you can have a ministerial meeting and a very good civil servant will be there, but it's not always attended by the ministers. In our case, most of the time the ministers are in situ. In fact, just before this event, I've just been to a meeting with the finance and local government minister, who was talking to us about her draft budget and what civic society wanted to see for recovering from COVID in the draft budget, and she chaired that meeting. So they're very positive. We have ministerial community meetings as well. So obviously, I think like everybody, you have access to your ministers, but actually our ministers will often have a constituency access, where if you're a constituent, you can talk to them about what's matters to you as a citizen, but they'll often have a portfolio email as well. So you can be a citizen connected to any kind of community group, and you might not be part of a ministerial meeting, but you can still feed into those meetings and feed into that portfolio and have some feedback. Funding is another issue for obviously the civic society in Wales and across the whole of the UK. In Wales, we have quite a good relationship in terms of funding, although it isn't perfect by any means. And I'm sure there'll be people listening in on the webinar from Wales going, well, you know, we don't see any of it. And that certainly is true. We have a challenge about equity of getting funding out to the whole of civic society in the right ways. We do have at least some dedicated funding streams. So as I said, we do have the Third Sector Partnership Council. We have a Third Sector Recovery Fund that's been involved in the last 12 months to go out to local community groups to be able to make an impact on supporting people who've been hardest hit through COVID. We've got a volunteer fund, and we obviously had a very strong relationship before the European funding came to an end, and now there's a new prosperity fund, which is creating its own issues and challenges for the devolved nations, I think. But previous to that, when we had the European funding, Welsh Government would have that, and then it was administered through WCVA in partnership with civic society groups across Wales and local communities and health boards to get that out to the most hardest to reach communities. So those are some of the kind of key structural things. I suppose in terms of what could we do better, in Wales, we're very good at creating some wonderful bits of policy, well-meaning policy and legislation. So we've got the Future Generations and Wellbeing Act, and it's an ambitious bit of policy, and it's cross-cutting, cross-departmental, and it enables areas of civic society from different areas and also from different parts of government to come together to look at how we improve things for Wales and for the generations that are coming through. However, it still gets hit with bureaucracies around, well, this is our bit in our department, and this is your bit in your department. And we have a Future Generations Commissioner, and it's that commissioner's role to help to oversee those conversations. And actually the commissioner who's in post at the moment is a very good commissioner, but even that commission has struggles sometimes with bringing some of those partners together. So we still get hit sometimes with the bureaucracy, even though we come up with creative ideas of collaboration. David touched on the word co-production. It's a strong buzzword in Wales. There's a lot of positive examples of co-production at a community grassroots level. Co-production is written through an awful lot of our government documents, and it was written into recent manifestos for the Welsh elections. but the reality of putting co-production in practice is still some distance away, and so there's some real evolution that's needed. We still often find ourselves in a place where civic society will get involved in a conversation to ask our opinion, and then someone else goes off and designs something, and then it's, now we want you to deliver it, and that's not real co-production. So we still have that as a challenge. And we still have issues around resilience of the sector, but I'm sure that's not just in our part of the world. I think that's everywhere, but we still have those issues. So touching on things like multi-year funding, there are a couple of areas of multi-year funding in Wales, but equally we have the same problem of year on year, and the ability to be able to build on the impact that the civic society is having and the partnerships that we try and do, particularly cross-departmental partnerships, is a challenge when it's year on year. Controversially, as a point, when we raise that sometimes with our government colleagues in Wales, they will say, well, that's not always down to us. Sometimes that's down to the relationship they have with the UK government and the allocations that come through from the UK government to then enable Welsh government to be able to make some decisions about where they can put their funding. So I guess there's, as we all know, there's always some pull and sway on the tensions that are devolved and a sort of national government level. And there's still the issue around recognising the value of core engagement and project engagement. And historically, many years ago, there was core funding for probably the same organisations, and government moved away from that with a view to making it project, with the aspiration, I think, genuinely behind it, of positivity, of creating innovative ideas. But in doing so, what you do is you potentially destabilise really vital conversations with groups and community citizens that need that funding. So we have that tension between what is core and what is project or what is innovation, and how do you manage the two things together to make sure you have the healthiest civic society you can, and also the healthiest relationship going forward. So I'll just pause there.
Thank you, Kate. Absolutely fascinating. I would love to be a fly on the wall in some of those ministerial advisory groups. I didn't realise that WCVA is funded by government. I might just ask, while I have you, is the fact that it is funded by government, does that shape the relationship that it has with government? Does it feel more like a partnership? Does it feel free to challenge and lobby?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't get all its funding from government, thankfully. Otherwise, I think it would be a challenge. I think it's a challenge for any of us as civic organisations when you are funded by government or local authority or any public body, if you've got an element to you which is campaigning and lobbying for change. So it's there. But I would say that in Wales, when WCVA has, as an organisation, gone, this is what is required for the third sector, the civic society, to move forward, and it might be a challenge to government officials or challenge to a particular minister, that challenge is usually heard positively in terms of actually being allowed to be put forward, and not a fear of being able to campaign for a particular issue. And maybe that's down to the relationship status that exists, and the understanding of this is the civic society, and the fact that part of that funding in WCVA's contract is there's a bit about you are there to make sure you represent the voice back to us. So I guess if they did and government went, well, we don't want to hear that bit, then they'd be breaching their own contract of funding as well. But we have to acknowledge it's a tension. It always is, isn't it, for any of us that are funded by government to then lobby government. It's always a tension.
Thank you, Kate. And then finally, the Scottish perspective from Teresa.
Okay, thanks, Anishka, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. A lot of what I've got in front of me is very similar to what David and Kate has said, so I'm going to try and mix it up a little bit and give a couple of examples of policy perspectives that could be a little bit comparative. But I want to have a caveat which says this is not about Scottish exceptionalism. It's not about we get it right and everyone gets it wrong, but just to maybe mix up some of the discussion today, some policy issues where I think we have done well in Scotland, and I'm sure there'll be other examples from across the UK. What do I agree with in terms of what David and Kate have said? We do have a glib phrase, Scotland the village, and we apply that often when we go to meetings, which is the same people at multiple meetings, the same challenges and the same opportunities that gives. My personal judgment is the opportunities far outweigh the challenges, and we can talk about that later in the Q&A section. The thing that Kate said that most resonated with me as a charity chief executive, as well as vice chair of SCVO, was that resilience is a huge issue. And resilience, it's a bit like Reagan, isn't it? The economy, the economy, the economy. I think if we had to have one word that summed up the challenges of civil society, it's not the work we do or the outcomes we achieve, it's the resilience of those organisations that work within it. So those are the parts that I would very broadly agree with David and Kate's remarks. Although I would see a little bit of maybe challenge back in terms of campaigning and lobbying, Kate. I think in terms of, and whether this is a Scottish context, Enable Scotland is, as it says on the tin, a Scottish charity, we are very much a small but forceful campaigning and lobbying organisation with a huge health and social care and employability arm next to it. But that, in terms of ratio of income, is 1 million to 59 million this year, but it's the £1 lobbying and campaigning arm that is the strongest voice of the organisation, as it should be. So I do think that we have gotten that right, if I speak about my organisation, but I think that's not down to me or the organisation. Partly that's down to the context in which we operate in, where the government do expect that level of holding to account from a policy perspective. So broadly, in terms of previous remarks, that's where I would sit with those. There's a lot to learn from each other. There is a lot to learn, and we talk about lessons from the Devolved Nations. I think the one thing I would say is it is very much about that two-way street. I don't think anyone has got it perfectly right, but I do think we have had some maturity in terms of devolution in Scotland that perhaps gives us some insights into how we might continue to do the things we do well, do more of it, and actually what are some of the things we might think about that don't work so well from a civil society perspective. So if I put a policy context and give a live example of that, we recently had some data in Scotland that says the number of heart attacks in Scotland have dropped by 74% in the last 15 years. Now you can go back and from a linear perspective, absolutely put that down to civil society lobbying government for a complete smoking ban in public places. So 15 years later, we're starting to see, as David talked about, the outcomes, the health inequality has been challenged, and some real positive sense of where a policy in a Scottish context, I think most people would agree, drove the policy context across the rest of the UK. And I think what we could have seen, had we not been so strong in our policy context, as campaigned for by civil society, perhaps a partial ban in other parts of the UK. So hindsight's a wonderful thing, but I think a really good practical example of where a devolved administration has taken a brave but good step with positive population outcomes that's had lessons for the rest of the country. There will be many examples, I see, that go back the other way. The difficulty we have, I think, from a UK perspective right now is we live in very interesting times. Before today's chat, Kate and David and I were talking about the political party context within which we all operate in. So the fact that we have very different governments leading, different political parties leading our governments. We have a very strong SNP government in Scotland. We have the Conservatives at Westminster. We have the power sharing, David, that you've alluded to. And then, of course, we have the Welsh context in terms of the Labour Party. So we have very different political parties in terms of leading our governments, but what does that mean for civil society? And actually, again, I would go back to there are more similarities in terms of the third sector and how we deal with political parties. And one of the things I think is very strong about, particularly in the devolved nations, and I can talk about Scotland, is we are very political party neutral. but actually very policy positive. So as an ecosystem of the third sector, we're very much driven by the policies that we think will make a difference, irrespective of who the political party in power is at that point in time. Now, I think that doesn't always come across when you read the press around Scotland and what's happening, and often it's around the divisive issue around referendum and what that might look like in the future. But my own experience tells me that civil society in Scotland today is very strong, irrespective of which political party is leading or which political party is leading a specific policy. So I think quite a cohesive civil society when it comes to lobbying, government and campaigning. We, like David and Kate said, are a very small country, and despite being a very small country, we have 40,000 voluntary organisations and 24,000 registered charities. So that's a real strength, that jigsaw of civil society in Scotland, a population of 5 million, just slightly the same or round about the same as the whole of the northwest of England. However, one of the things I talk about often, and one of the things that really attracted me to pro bono and the work of the Law Family Commission, was the fact across 24,000 charities, do we perhaps have duplication in civil society? And I think the answer to that is resoundingly yes. Now, I've sometimes been misquoted as said there are too many charities. I think there are not too many charities, and there can never be too many great outcomes from charities, but we can absolutely see that on occasion in civil society, we can have too much replication of similar charities looking for similar outcomes. And let me just give you one example that touches my charity daily and we talk about often. The bulk of our work from a contract perspective would be around health and social care. So for a population of just around 5 million, we have over 1,000 health and social care charities and organisations providing health and social care services. So that's huge. Now, they all do, by and large, great work, but we also have a policy context of self-directed support. So I would argue there's a bit of a paradox. How can we improve outcomes, continue to strengthen the role of civil society and charities, but perhaps look at some of those areas where duplication might be in fact making us less effective than we could be? And that doesn't mean to say we're not doing a great job, but to challenge ourselves, could we do better? And we have a phrase that we use often internally, which we hold ourselves to account. Because you're doing good work doesn't mean you're doing it well. And actually, should we be challenging ourselves to see how can we get better outcomes as an ecosystem of civil society in Scotland? So, having said that, where does that fit into the infrastructure that Kate talked about? We obviously have our main legislative body in Holyrood. We have 32 local authorities, Kate, and we have 14 geographical health boards and another 7 special boards. So again, some of that duplication, and particularly when it comes to digital, so bear that in mind. I think what we do see is a small country where people can make a difference in a policy perspective, but still an unwieldy bureaucracy when it comes to how do we navigate those public sector bodies, not just that hold the purse strings, but also actually hold the policy and decision-making powers. I do think we do that well in Scotland. I'm vice chair of SCVO, so I'm probably slightly biased, but I will say that up front. But I do think what we have is a way of working that is by and large collaborative, but still many things that could be improved. But I think the improvements are from both sides. I think civil society has to improve on its single voice on the big issues, and government absolutely has to improve how it works with us. And essentially the thing we don't talk about often enough, which PBE does, as you'll be aware, Anushka, is the role of the private sector in some of this work. So some of the most effective work I do in my day job is actually with a hugely impactful partnership between the private sector, the public sector, and Enable Scotland as a social sector charity. And actually we don't talk about that enough. you know, and those are quite difficult partnerships sometimes to get off the ground. Because if you think it's difficult trying to be an equal partner with government, it is hugely difficult, it's my experience, to be seen as an equal partner with the private sector. And that's something that we have to change. And collectively, I think as devolved nations, we can all work towards that. And that's why the work of PBE and the Law Family Commission is particularly important and particularly timely. David mentioned the fact that we have Scotland's National Performance Framework. That's one of the mechanisms that helps us as a country focus on outcomes and helps us as civil society organisations be more alert to how we collaborate and collectively deliver our outcomes for our citizens. And I want to just make one quick point around a more recent policy initiative where I think civil society in Scotland did make a huge difference in a way that we didn't see in other parts of the UK. And again, forgive me, it's not about Scottish exceptionalism, but a live example that I'm very proud of and was very close to. We understand at the start of the pandemic in particular, when we started then thinking about vaccines as we moved through the pandemic, there was lots of concerns about the role of JCVI and where we made decisions about who should be vaccinated and in what priority. And there was a lack of consensus, I would argue, in terms of the field of people with learning disabilities. Now, you will have seen lots of different lobbying and lots of different campaigning and lots of different ways to try and change some of that across the devolved nations. I think we did that very well in Scotland. I think civil society organisations very quickly, and the proof is in the public domain, moved to lobby and campaign and to support government with the evidence that says JCVI says this. Here is the reality on the ground for people with learning disabilities. Therefore, we want to make it much easier and much simpler for people with learning disabilities, irrespective of whether or not they're known to GPs, to access vaccinations. And we very quickly moved to change that guidance in Scotland. In my view, time will tell, that will have had a significant impact on the data in terms of the impacts of the pandemic on a group of people who are already at the sharp end of health inequalities. So we can look at the smoking ban going back 15 years and the linear effect on heart attacks. And then we can look at something like the guidance on vaccinations for people with learning disabilities, where Scotland has taken quite a different view and actually had some positive outcomes. Although, as I say, we do sometimes get quite a lot wrong, but I'll not talk about that too much today. So finally, just to say, we do have an operating environment which, if I think about some of the colleagues I work with in the rest of the UK, feels slightly different, feels quite positive, but is not perfect. And to use a phrase which I think is very much in vogue, if we study and apply what works for each other in different parts of the UK, all of us can level up, all of us can build forward better, not back better. But a final plug for PBE, all of us can unleash the potential of civil society everywhere by working with both the public sector and the private sector collaboratively together. So hopefully that's given you a sense of a Scottish context along with David and Kate from earlier.
Many thanks, Teresa, and thanks for the commission plug, our unleashing catchphrase. I did have one question for you in the Scottish context. So you've talked very interestingly about sort of how civil society is engaged in policy development in Scotland. Something that people may be aware of is that actually the Scottish social sector secured quite a significant package of investment from the Scottish government over the pandemic, so much higher than the Barnett formula allocation that would have been allocated by the UK government support for the social sector. I'm sort of interested in what you think sort of drove that additional support, and also with that on the back of quite in-depth conversations between SCBO and the government. It sounds like there is a sort of maybe the closeness of that relationship is what sort of fostered the openness of discussions about how much support the sector needed.
Yeah, so I would say two things for those who are not from Scotland on the call. We did secure, prior to the big government announcement and the Barnett consequentials of the pandemic money which came across the UK, we secured £350 million for wellbeing ahead of that announcement, in addition to the Barnett consequentials. And I would love to take the credit for that, Anushka, but credit absolutely goes to SCVO and to the Chief Executive, Anna Fowley, and to some of the other organisations who work very closely as membership bodies to ensure that the work that we do as civil society is recognised. So I think there was a pre-existing understanding from government that the best way to get the money to the front line was through civil society and charitable organisations. So huge kudos to Anna and the team at SCVO for what existed prior to the pandemic, supporting what happened during the pandemic. And the second thing I would argue, which I think is really, really important here, there is a sense in Scotland that and I've heard this more when I've been on sort of, London's think tanky type things. So forgive me, Anushka, not just PB, but other ones of, you can't lobby and deliver government contracts. There's a sense in Scotland that you can lobby and campaign. I don't think I deliver £60 million of government contracts. I deliver £60 million of citizen contracts. Through the self-directed support framework, the money comes from government from the funnel, but it belongs to the citizens. So I think we already had mechanisms which meant that direct routes, whether it be through individual budgets, individual service funds, or direct access to cash to individual citizens, is much more part of our DNA in Scotland, potentially. I don't have the data that backs that up, but hopefully we'll get some, Anushka. But that idea about SEO being very strong, but also having that sense of an ethos of self-directedness around campaigning charities actually delivering for social good, I think is very much accepted. And whilst your stats at the beginning around the manifestos were interesting in terms of word count, if you listen to the debates in Scotland for the Holyrood elections this year, lots of talk and consensus across every political party about the role of civil society in delivering for the citizen. So I think it was twofold.
Brilliant, thank you, Teresa. In our last 12 minutes, sorry, I haven't been keeping these going as fast as I should. Questions are coming in. So here's one question. I think it was Kate who was talking about resilience, and there was a question about whether the sector and government actually have a shared understanding of what resilience means for civil society. How do you know that? How do you know if the sector is being resilient? How do you measure it? Is that something that the government should be caring about? Is it something that the government does care about? I'm going to go, is that all right, to David first on that, to see if that's something that you thought about within the context, the policy context in your mind.
Yeah, no, it is an important one. And I think there's a couple of dimensions to this. Firstly, it goes back to the point I made about the need for better mutual understanding and respect in central government for the work that voluntary community sector organisations do. Too often the relationship is a sort of transactional procurement type relationship rather than a genuine partnership. And I think we need to move more to, I'm talking about from a central government perspective, to recognise that third sector organisations provide really valuable services and we need to treat them as partners. And key to that is providing some means of ensuring that there is long-term funding. Too much time is spent by government and by organisations in having to seek repeat funding for the same type of service. And this is wasteful in so many ways. And like it means even some of the charities I'm involved with now, we're having to look at putting people on 90-day notice once a year because we can't be sure of forward funding. So I think that's one of the really big issues that does need to be addressed. And I think is capable of being addressed at central government level, but it just needs, I think, some bolder action than we've maybe seen before. That would be my main point on resilience.
Thank you. Any different perspectives from Scotland and Wales?
I wouldn't disagree, David. I think long-term funding is definitely part of it, but resilience is also around, and it's a phrase we don't often use in the social sector, strong business planning. You can be a charity with great charitable purpose, but you do need to have a plan that says your income will exceed your expenditure. And for all the right reasons, often charities, that's not the case. And what we're seeing, if you look at the data in Scotland, is a number of charities paying from reserves to keep the operational lights on. And I think that's the concern I have, which is not today in a post-COVID environment where we are in a better cash position with some of the funds, but actually how do we address some of those structural issues around resilience for charities where the work is so needed and so valued, but we haven't quite got the model right and how we run them in the long term in very difficult circumstances.
Yeah, I would support exactly what Teresa and David had said. I mean, interesting, somebody's just popped in the chat column about civic society being bigger than social enterprises and charities and talking about engaging community groups. And I think resilience, often we focus on resilience of funding, and that's a critical fact, but actually resilience in terms of community asset, I think is another area that we haven't always dealt with very well, and I think that's an issue for us as in civic society organisations and groups, but it's also an issue for government in terms of recognising those partnerships. So sometimes with organisations, we're perhaps not always making the best use of our immediate community assets and partnerships and like for like use of building spaces or volunteering roles, our young people who want to give and do different things. And Teresa's point about duplication, sometimes we'll have a lot of people doing a lot of very similar things, and we're not always very good at just stopping and having a pause and going, well, we're all doing this, maybe we can do it together a little bit better, which then in a way makes the argument easier to government in terms of what do we mean by resilience of funding then. So which bit of this requires ongoing funding? It goes back to that point I made about core and what's project, what's temporary to get some innovation stuff going, what's actually a permanent thing. And David's point about organisation jumping through hoops just to keep doing the same thing that is still required as an essential thing is very wasteful. But it's I don't think anyone, I mean, the question was, have we got a definition of resilience? The answer is no. But I think what's really interesting is we're all starting to have a proper conversation about what we mean by resilience. And I think Teresa's point about we all need to learn better from each other so we can not just build back, but build forward is effectively the resilience question, if that makes sense.
Thank you. And thanks for all the questions. I'm afraid I'm going to try and sort of collate a couple of questions if I can here. And worth reading them because there's also some interesting sort of commentary and insights here. There's a question here about sort of actually how does civil society and devolved nations engage with Whitehall, with central government, and especially as we sort of see changes like withdrawal from the EU and changes to landscape, that is going to actually impact maybe how organisations in the devolved nations need to build that relationship. And sort of linking into that, sort of, if you have insights on that nature of relationship, does that give you thoughts on how we could potentially change sort of England and Westminster's culture and practices? Do you have a sense of that comparator and what sort of why it does work? Maybe with your devolved parliaments, and maybe it doesn't work with Westminster. Does anybody like to start? Teresa.
So I'll probably just use a live example again, if I may, which is the recent Supreme Court judgment on Tomlinson versus Mencap and the kind of Whitehall and Westminster view of health and social care, and the kind of sense that it looks like from an outside perspective of legislation is the only answer. So a really difficult thorny issue, and I won't go into the details here, around how we pay our social care workforce. And actually it kind of dragged through the courts for a number of years. It went back and forth in terms of the decision. And ultimately, the people who are delivering health and social care, who we now know as our absolute key workers, suffered as a consequence. And I think how we dealt with that in Scotland was very positive around going to government with potential changes that didn't require legislation, but more around guidance and practice and working together with health and social care charities, to a point where the Scottish Living Wage was then applied to all hours worked. So actually, some of the concerns we see in how that Supreme Court judgment has come out for social care workers, actually we've bypassed that by a more collaborative way of working with civil servants, by offering a solution that didn't require legislation. So I would offer that up as an example from our perspective, but I'm sure there are many others back in the different way. It is a two-way street, but I have a lot of lived examples of that particular one.
Thank you, Teresa. David, maybe this isn't something you're less able to offer a perspective on, having the Northern Ireland civil service perspective. Do you have a sense of how that might, how the relationship with Westminster might vary?
Yeah, well, I suppose in terms of a relationship with civil society, it's a lot easier for those of us in small devolved administrations to actually have those strong relationships. You know, if you're based in Whitehall, it's much more difficult. And you know, I'm sort of wary about offering any thoughts or suggestions. But if in Whitehall there's a desire to try and replicate some of the good things that we do in the DAs, then I think you're going to need to have some sort of distributed structure around England. You know, because to do it from Whitehall on the way that we do it in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland would be really, really difficult. I suppose another thought about the sort of the national question, I think somebody asked the question, you know, do we have any issues about dealing with charities and voluntary and community organisations that are based in England? And yes, that would be an issue, because sometimes some of these very large organisations develop policy which perhaps doesn't fully take account of the nuances that we're facing in the devolved administrations. That's an issue for us that are working in charities as well. Just another very quick point to make, somebody referenced the importance of not just seeing civil society as voluntary community sector organisations, and that's absolutely right. And you know, again, one of the strengths, and I think Teresa and Kate have both acknowledged this as well, one of the reasons we were able to address the problems of the pandemic so well was the collaboration was between all sectors, and the business sector played a huge part in Northern Ireland in helping us to provide support to vulnerable people, working in conjunction with community sector organisations. So there's a lot more that we can do to actually build on that as well, getting everybody working together.
Thanks, David. And Kate, in 1 minute, if you could summarise your reflections.
In 1 minute. I would agree with what everybody else has said. I mean, Teresa's example is a good example. We had a very similar thing during the pandemic, where there was a partnership around homelessness and making sure that our vulnerable people who are homeless had safe places to be, and we miraculously, having discussed homelessness for decades, found a resolution to it very quickly, in partnership with civic society and government and private partnerships, and everybody involved. Just effectively society came together and went, this is a problem and we should find an answer to it. So I suppose the question is, if somebody is willing, if there is a shared agenda and people are all willing, they want to come to find an answer to it, people genuinely come with that approach of, you know, it's not somebody's better at that or this, it is a shared agenda, then that certainly will help. And I think David makes a very valid point that we've all touched on, the ability to form quite solid and good and fairly personal relationships in some ways with some key people in our devolved areas, and partly that's an advantage because we are smaller geographically, and maybe there is a need for Whitehall to look at how it might maybe enable people to form more close relationships on a regional level, so that, you know, those kind of connections can be made, because otherwise, without those relationships, then it is a challenge to feel like you can make a change, because you have to build up the trust to be able to talk honestly about what those ideas can be and those answers can be.
Thank you so much, Kate. And Thank you. I'm afraid we won't get to all the questions, and they've all poured in now, but this has been really interesting. And what's really struck me is the number of similarities that have come through from this in terms of what makes things work. Some of those are just sort of contextual. They're about sort of size, they're about close-knit communities and personal relationships. But some of them really are about sort of cultures and structures. So we had a lot about sort of collaborative working with civil servants. We talked about shared agendas, about politicians having backgrounds in and connections to civil society, and also sort of outcome-based approaches to policy development. You know, similar challenges that we definitely have, you know, across the UK in terms of sort of long-term funding, sort of challenges to resilience, and sort of complexity actually of public sector bodies, and the complexity of the devolved administrations as well. But look, so much great content in there. Thank you all so much for your time, and thank you attendees. A reminder, you can visit the Commission website, you can read more about what we're doing there. You can rewatch this event if you would really love to, but you can certainly share it with friends or colleagues, and we'll send around the link later. And I think that's all there is to say. So go and enjoy this sort of tentative summer that is here around the corner today. Thank you.